Welcome to the Zoom conference, Reimagining, Reinventing Policing, sponsored by the University of Chicago. My name is Julian Go. I'm a professor of sociology here at the University of Chicago, and I'm the lead convener of this conference. We have a wonderful and stimulating program for you all that will cover most of today and tomorrow. Just to introduce things, I don't want to say too much. I just want to make a couple of remarks. First, the impetus for this conference should already be clear. We in the United States are facing a crucial and in some ways novel moment, a moment when people have been taking to the streets to protest police violence and racism, a moment when citizens have been raising their voices and demanding change. What this conference is meant to do is to bring together some speakers who have been adding their voices to these demands. Now, of course, there are a lot of possible speakers and lots of voices we could have featured here in this conference. Criminal justice lawyers, criminology scholars, more legal scholars, activists, maybe even more law enforcement officers themselves. But what this conference represents is necessarily a selection, a small slice of those wider panoply of voices. No conference can cover all the voices. My hope is that by hearing these voices over the next days, we can open up further discussions and other people will be inspired to hold other forums that can feature additional voices as well. That said, it should also be clear that while the speakers today are necessarily a selection, they don't necessarily form a single viewpoint. They each have their own things to say. They represent a diversity of views, and some of their views may even conflict with each other. Some may speak about abolishing or defunding police. Others may speak of transforming the police. Others may speak of other things entirely. But what all of our speakers share is the fact that they have all done serious research or serious thinking and critical reflection about policing and related issues. And many of them have also been on the streets or in the halls of government on the front lines of struggles for justice and change. And finally, what all of our speakers share, I think, is this: a willingness to seriously consider, whether or not they all agree exactly, but at least to consider reimagining and reinventing police rather than just reforming it. There is a difference. To reform something is to take it as it is and tinker with it and keep it more or less intact. But to reinvent, to reimagine, is to redefine and transform, maybe even to the point of non-recognition. After all, policing does not have to mean the hierarchical, bureaucratic, militarized, coercive organizations that we see today. The wider meaning of the concept police, which was in fact the meaning that had been used historically, the wider meaning is simply to refer to some kind of regulation or management of our social order so as to ensure the well-being of our communities. Now, that regulation and management could be completely democratic rather than hierarchical. It could come from the bottom up rather than the top down. And the well-being of communities that policing would look after does not have to be defined simply as the suppression of crime. It could also be defined as achieving the maximum happiness and health for everyone, and not just for a small privileged class. So to begin to think about these alternative possibilities, which may or may not necessitate police departments as we know them today, to begin to think about these possibilities is to begin to reimagine and reinvent. And that's what I hope our discussions today and tomorrow will help us begin to do. So just to conclude this introduction, I want to thank the University of Chicago's Social Sciences Division that has funded this program and the team who helped put this together. You know, Zoom conferences like these seem on their face to be straightforward and simple, but actually we've learned they're not as easy as one might think. So I'd like to thank Joe Bonney, Meredith Klassen, Karen Norsetina, Kimberly K. Wong, Shannon Morrissey, Elizabeth Braun-Rush, Eos Trinidad, and Sarah Outland for their help in putting this together. And of course, all the presenters and moderators of the panels who agreed to participate. So let me now turn things over to Amanda Woodward. Amanda Woodward is Dean of the Division of the Social Sciences and the William S. Gray Distinguished Professor of Psychology. And she is one of the key people who really helped make this conference possible in the first place. So I thank her and I turn things over to her.
Thank you, Julian. I want to start by saying how completely delighted I am that you are now my colleague at the University of Chicago, and that as you join us, you're bringing a really important event to our campus. So thank you for that. I also want to thank each of the panelists for making the time to come together and participate in this important project. And I'm really delighted that the Social Sciences Division and the University of Chicago is able to serve as the virtual host for this important convening. Over the next 2 days, there'll be a number of panels, 8 panels, that will reflect a really remarkable gathering of scholars, elected officials, activists, students, and many others. Addressing the problems of systemic racism and biased policing in the US and elsewhere requires the social sciences. It's a place where our scholarship as social scientists has a particular importance and relevance. But it requires that insight in combination with the broader range of perspectives that this conference is convening. Each of the panels in the conference will explore ways in which that dialogue between social science research and broader perspectives can inform policy and activism and moving toward important directions of concrete change. As a community of scholars, the Division of the Social Sciences and the University of Chicago embraces open debate and discussion, including critical discussion. And I know that what lies ahead of us will be open and critical and vigorous discussion. I'm looking forward to that. All of your perspectives are essential to understanding how policing can and should be reimagined and reinvented. The knowledge and insight and ideas and the discussions that will play out over the next 2 days, will have broad impact for scholarly work, for what we will take away with us as scholars, but also for policy implementation and more generally for addressing one of the most urgent issues of our time. I'm really looking forward to the discussions ahead, and I'll turn it over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Woodward. I would like now to start the first panel. We have 3 fantastic speakers. What we'll do is we'll go in alphabetical order. I'll introduce each speaker, and then that speaker will speak for about 15 minutes or so. And then I'll introduce the next speaker, and then they'll speak until we come to the point where we can have things open up for Q&A, if that works out. So first up, I'd like to introduce Philip Mcharris. Philip Mcharris is a joint PhD candidate in sociology and African American studies at Yale University. He's done fantastic research on race, punishment, and policing with a special focus on how Brooklyn residents have dealt with police violence, among other topics. He's also been an important activist organizing student protests in Boston following the death of Trayvon Martin. He's also the co-founder of the New York City chapter of BYP 100, the Black Youth Project. He's also made many media appearances, writing for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Al Jazeera, and Essence. He's also written and he's also been seen on HBO, CNN, PBS, ABC News, and other outlets discussing policing issues. So Philip, thank you very much for coming, and I turn things over to you.
Thank you. I didn't know if I was going to go first, but I guess we're here. You know, I just wanted to say I appreciate the organizers in the University of Chicago for organizing this, and I'm excited about the 2 days of panels. So just to start, you know, my research has focused on what I refer to as Carver Projects, which is a high-rise housing development in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood in Brooklyn. And it's a 24-story high-rise housing project. And really what I've been exploring is the day-to-day experience of residents as they navigate concerns surrounding safety, policing, and cycles of poverty. And so I began the field work in 2017 and continued through the present. And largely the field work is based off of participant observation, archival research as well, survey data, administrative documents. And, you know, the design is that, you know, I embedded myself in community institutions, families, gathering spaces. And, you know, a big part of this is that the ways in which policing has operated in the context has changed and transformed over the years that I have studied. And so, you know, I would like to bring that in. And so next, I just wanted to give a snapshot of what policing is like on a day-to-day, and how it's transformed over time. So during the initial months of fieldwork, there was a mobile command center that was stationed 24/7 across the street from Carver Projects. And at the times, officers were seen usually inside and rarely outside of the mobile unit. And in 2018, midway through the fieldwork, renovations to the front part of the lobby began in Carver Projects. And the construction took over a year longer to complete than initially communicated. And the renovations of the lobby and outwardly facing aspect of the entrance communicated that, the priority focused on appearances from the outside first, because things like new elevators and completely renovated apartments didn't take precedent. And just for context, also in over the recent months, there's been no gas in the entire building. The gas lines have been out. And residents have also had to experience elevators that have also malfunctioned. But to jump back, so once the lobby was finished, police presence in the immediate area surrounding Carver Projects grew immensely. For the months prior, the police were located across the street, as I mentioned, usually in their squad car or in front of the mobile command unit. However, after the renovations, police began to stand either inside the lobby or just outside of it, or inside their vehicle that's parked right outside of the residence. And now 2 police officers remain stationed in or near or around the lobby at all times, 24/7. And occasionally the officers may remain in their car parked, or they might remain in the lobby. But the police squad car outside has the red and blue police flashing lights cycling throughout the days and nights. And for residents that have windows facing the street, persistent police lights can be disturbing, especially for sleep. And for some residents, the shift was disorienting. And in terms of the how this began, the heightened presence and contact is often under the umbrella of community-oriented policing efforts, and such addition of officers, often called beat officers or beat cops, who patrol particular areas to patrol the building and throughout the days and nights. And this is sort of the guise of what in New York City is called neighborhood policing, which is the specific iteration of community policing in the city. But in the specific area, this growing police presence has occurred absent of any discernible increases in reported crime or violence in the residents or in the surrounding area. There was one major incident that did send shockwaves in 2017, which was a robbery inside the development. But outside of that, there hasn't been any uptick or any high-profile incidences, at least in the public spaces. So the emergence of constant police presence has occurred in the sensible absence of any surges in violence or conflict or harm. And decisions around police deployments often boil down to crime reports and the creation of hotspots, where there's using CompStat data in various forms of data. Police design or designate certain areas as being crime-ridden or dangerous. And housing projects are often constructed as hotspots inherently and have received considerable attention amongst policing and criminal legal entities, who have argued that public housing is often more dangerous and crime-filled than other areas of the city. And usually this is without taking in or without seriously considering the broader context and from a structural analysis and how inequality shapes all of these various dynamics. But importantly, residents often define threats to safety in vastly different ways than what neatly translates to reported crime, especially given that many things that can be described as criminal often go underreported. And even more, activities that are prohibited under criminal codes but central to survival are often criminalized, and people are punished for the strategies of navigating poverty and deprivation, which is often very high in public housing residents, including the one that I've been doing research in. So thus hotspots are constructed from data, one, that do not always closely correlate to how residents envision safety, and two, are driven largely by the policing and criminalization of activities that are deemed necessary to survival. And in effect, hotspots reify the punishment of survival strategies by directing police resources toward places that are heavily criminalized, leading to discomfort and unease that do little to actually sustainably reduce the kinds of violence and harm that residents most feel threaten their safety. And at times, leaders of the tenant association are consulted around police presence, and at times the resident association leaders are more readily open to the idea of police, high concentrations of police in the neighborhood, as opposed to residents who might not be involved in the tenant association. But also, just to that point, scores of complaints around apartment units, building safety, malfunctioning elevators are made by residents in the association each year. In the context of decades-long government neglect of the residents, police presence can feel as the government is finally exercising a sense of responsibility. And in other ways, the presence of police as an ostensible means of public safety can feel like an amenity, as people lack security or doormen that typically exist in higher end high-rise buildings, such as luxury condos, to help cultivate a sense of safety. Police typically stand inside or just outside the lobby. As I mentioned, they often speak to themselves and rarely interact with residents and people passing by. And if not speaking amongst themselves, the police are often silent, standing quietly and often awkwardly. Police rarely open the doors for individuals when they are inside the lobby or just outside the entrance, even if individuals demonstrate that they do not have the keys or are struggling to find them as a result of carrying too many things, such as groceries. And the building also does not have a system to ring or call residents from downstairs, and lacks a mechanism for residents to open the entrance from their own unit. But this model of policing is sort of given as the major safety plan, even though it doesn't actually reflect the kinds of visions or plans that can actually help and mitigate and make people and residents feel secure in the context. And as a result of the vertical nature of the building, residents and visitors are forced to interface with police, as they are the only gateway to the building and elevator waiting area. In more horizontal residences, police may walk around the premises, but contact and interaction can be avoided by circumnavigating wherever the police are, especially around particular entrances. But in Carver projects, residents can't avoid the police. And for those residents who routinely feel targeted by the police, the forced interaction can be triggering and anxiety inducing. So again, the squad car is almost always parked outside of the building. And the shifts have, again, happened absent of any major increase in any reported crime or violence, which is what the data suggests. But at the same time, gentrification has increased rapidly in recent years in the specific area, as the surrounding census tract's income has nearly doubled in rent prices in neighborhood income for the surrounding census tracts. And signifiers of that gentrification, in some ways, one potential reason for the increase in police presence in the surrounding neighborhood is to make the neighborhood appear and be more favorable to more resource, increasingly white residents in the surrounding area. Research shows that periods of gentrification, specifically around policing in the forms of arrests, summonses, stops, and presence, significantly increases. And police often partner with real estate developers and business owners to develop policing strategies for specific areas, which is consistent with the work by Dr. Monica Bell, who finds that police are pivotal in maintaining racial residential segregation and racial boundary maintenance. In the feeling that police are there to control and harass residents, in addition to the economic deprivation and subsequent societal alienation experienced by residents, create a different set of worldviews that run counter to the criminal codes and the expectations set forth by police in the criminal legal system. And just to shift gears, I think in terms of thinking about as fields and as a broader field of social science, I think a lot of what the findings and results from what I've been studying suggest is that the sorts of questions often shape the outcome or what ends up being shared. Because one of the biggest conundrums that I've had is that in the context, people often have views of policing as illegitimate, but at times some people actually do advocate for increases in policing, especially older residents who police often specifically reach out to. And during interviews, one thing that I ask is, how people experience and feel around the increase in policing. And, also if there was an alternative, how people respond. Like if there was an alternative safety plan or intervention for safety and security, how might your response to what safety looks like be different? And here, one thing that I want to raise is that police and the criminal legal system are not separate external entities, but are institutions that socialize and teach people what justice is, what are adequate responses to harm, and who are the providers of safety. So people are told that police are the stewards of public safety, and in turn, at times, certain people ask for more police, especially given that for Black and poor and marginalized communities, despite what these communities ask for, police and carceral responses are often the only things that are provided, especially in recent decades. And just to share some interview quotes that I think capture these aspects. One interview was with a 46-year-old Black man who is a community resident who grew up in the neighborhood. And what he shared is, it would be like condos. The only difference is resources and a doorman. Police standing out there, it's the worst. It's awkward. You just stand there feeling crazy, out of place, especially if you're waiting for somebody. You put a security box there and a doorman, do something with the grass, it would be like condos. It should be a security guard and a doorman. You're gonna see the doorman, you're gonna see the security guard, grass gonna look a little different. But right now you're making the area feel dangerous, because when police be around, it's because something just happened or is about to happen. Now, because of gentrification, they moving back. So they got the police there, put a spotlight and put lights right in the middle of the block. And another interview with a 26-year-old Black mother, she shared cops in the beginning, just for context, during the beginning when the George Floyd protests erupted, the cops weren't in front of the building for the first time in months. And so back to this interview, cops no longer in front of the building. They weren't there today or yesterday. Don't expect them to be. They're afraid, quitting. They need to go other places. People are turning up. But I did see a paddy wagon by the corner store. But we are told to obey, listen, be quiet while y'all beat, y'all yell, y'all touch, scream all in our face, talk to us like we are nothing. Why do I need to obey you? I'm not gonna tell my kids or anybody to trust the police. Why do you think people are dying in their house or don't know how to deal with domestic violence? Police beat their wives. Officers can't even get fired. You killed a man. Cops sexually assault and abuse women, touching. They hate females. We're supposed to shut our mouths, so as soon as they open their mouth or someone with authority, it's a thing, it's a problem. They're on the wrong side of history. No way I'm gonna teach my kids to obey and listen when they have no mercy. Here, the main thing that I wanna point out is that for many people, it's not a good apple or a bad apple or a question of which police are nice or well-meaning, but rather a structural analysis that renders policing as a system illegitimate. So just in terms of what this all means, I think it's important, one, to really consider the various ways in which violence and policing and violence from carceral systems happen. And it's not just the killings. It's not just the sensationalized violence. It's also the brutality, the sexual violence, and it's also the everyday experience of being afraid or having anxiety increase when police are present. And that's the sort of structural violence that statistics can't necessarily capture. And also, oftentimes when we think around safety, the focus has been around, deterrence and policing, because even though there's this acknowledgement that structural inequality gives rise to increased levels in conflict and violence and harm, and to truly address the concerns surrounding safety, it's necessary to provide resources and opportunities such as healthcare, quality school choices, universal basic income, safe housing, and accessible healthcare. But from what it has been shared and from the results also, that divesting from police presence and resources in favor of developing community-based alternatives to deal with emergency issues that do require intervention actually should potentially be the future of creating safer communities, which is consistent with what activists and organizers have been calling for across the country. And from what I've seen, the most effective way to increase safety in places such as Carver Projects is to address the centuries of racial and class inequality, and to make sure that everybody in the community has their basic needs met, and to develop alternative emergency response systems and teams that can respond to specific situations, and that don't rely on punishment and control. And to just, to bring in again, like this question of defunding and abolition, is not around, from what has been shared from activists and organizers, and also in terms of imagining alternatives, that it's not about abolishing or defunding safety or help. It's actually about creating responses that actually can guarantee safety and security. And most importantly, I think is making sure that communities around the country have their basic needs met, and have the resources and power to actually envision models of safety and security. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. It was great to hear your thoughts. To the audience, we will if we have time, we will be taking questions, so feel free to add your questions in the Q&A. Our next speaker is Alyasa Sewell. Alyasa Sewell is Associate Professor of Sociology at Emory University and founder and director of the Race and Policing Project. Professor Sewell has been using quantitative approaches to racism studies, looking at the empirical links between the political economy of race and racial healthcare disparities using policing and housing policy data. They published a number of scholarly articles around these issues, and most recently, various articles on the relationship between policing and the health and well-being of communities. Professor Sewell's Race and Policing Project, founded in July 2016, is a collaborative effort to curate research at the intersections of racial inequality and criminal injustice for community consumption and usage. I'll now turn it over to Alyasa. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for allowing me into the space. It's, I think you all understand it's a privilege to be here. It's a difficult place to be here. And it might be quite difficult for me because of many ways. Right now, probably yesterday, I actually had on my computer persons of under investigation data for COVID from the Georgia Department of Public Health. And this is the stuff that I talked to my mom about and my dad about, because they have these underlying conditions that influence COVID, hospitalizations and deaths and complications, even if you survive. So I guess it's, there's a personal connection there on various levels. I want to appreciate this moment for those reasons, and I want to invite you into a space, a fireside chat, so to speak, where we can have a more clear picture about the relationship, I would say, between policing, health, health disparities, medical sociology researching, and the moment we're in, the pandemic that we're in. So I'll start there and kind of before I can tell you the story as a researcher. In this environment, a person can die of COVID-19 and police needs at the same time. A person like George Floyd, who tested positive for COVID-19 months before his murder, who was unemployed at the time because his job needed to cut expenses due to the sharp decline in increased customer demands, who the medical examiners say he didn't die of legal intervention deaths, which is something I literally just published. I think the paper came out within 10 days, a Friday, I can't remember, on the illness associations of living within a neighborhood of New York City, which within the 10 years prior to the Floyd et al. Case in New York, against New York City Police Department, had more than 3 or more legal intervention deaths. And this is that time when the medical examiners say, yes, the police did it. They were engaged in legal action. They caused injury. The injury was fatal. And essentially what we're talking about is a formal, medicalized recognition of state-sanctioned violence. They said instead that he died of heart disease. But we all saw the video. So we're trying to, and what a lot of things I tried to do was reconcile that disparity, that dissonance, incongruence. So as a researcher, I can tell this story as a patient. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the vast majority of the population could only get tested for COVID if they had a recommendation from a doctor. I was one of those people. I was flagged because I had sustained a series of upper respiratory events rooted in my own underlying condition of asthma. Data from across the nation, and particularly unfortunately in Georgia, indicate that 80% of those people who die of COVID have underlying conditions. There's a range, and unfortunately I also studied the full range. So I'm going to focus on a block. And before I can tell that block, I have to tell you that I'm a particular type of researcher. I'm a researcher who can talk about what happens when anyone can walk across a space, a neighborhood, and engage the various conditions of that neighborhood and develop in them over time a set of biophysiological reactions that culminate in the expression of something that needs to be diagnosed, including the diabetes and the high blood pressure, and so on and so forth. So I want to tell you a story about a block, okay? Imagine a woman, 10 city blocks, and a community clinic. This woman has a 2 o'clock appointment to follow up with her physician about her diabetes care. She leaves her house 30 minutes before her meeting, plenty enough time to get to her appointment on time. On 5 of the 10 blocks she walks to that doctor's office, she witnesses a police officer patting down someone walking through the neighborhood. Most of these people she does not even recognize. Now take that same woman and place her in a block, a neighborhood, where she witnesses a police frisking a pedestrian on just one more block. So not 5 out of 10, but 6 out of 10. The neighborhoods are the same. In any other characteristics, arrest rates are fairly low. Less than 1 out of people unstopped are arrested. Robbery and incarcerates are not unique. Mid-range concentrations of Black and Latinos. This is New York City. 1 out of 5 families living below the poverty line. Half of the households bringing in more than $50,000 a year. A third of the housing units are occupied by owners. This is an average New York City neighborhood. The only difference being that one block. A doctor reviewing the file of that woman in that neighborhood, the neighborhood with that extra block of frisking, is 16% more likely to find an indicator of high blood pressure on her medical records. When he asked her to step on a scale to measure her weight, she is 20% more likely than her counterpart to register a body mass index that indicates she's morbidly obese. But it does not stop there. This woman in that neighborhood with that extra block is 15% more likely to present as comorbid with asthma, and the likelihood that she believes, that she perceives that her health is poor or fair is not ignorable. It's 10% more likely than her counterparts to indicate this. Her doctors have treatments for all of these issues. However, that symptom list, that checklist she is given upon her arrival at her doctor's office is unlikely to know that the 10 blocks she just walked is a key structural determinant of the health conditions they are left to treat. More insidiously, however, is that she's the mother of a son who walks through those same streets, probably even more so than she does, to, for instance, a school. He may head to the playground or visit his friends within a 2-mile radius that he lives, which, by the way, increases his exposure to personal contact with the police and the determinants of illness that, the presentations and manifestations of illness that come with that. There's a full range, unfortunately. When he shows up to a clinic like that, or a doctor's office, or a student health center is 10% more likely to indicate that he is experiencing nervousness. And, he doesn't really feel so much good about himself. He feels a little worthless. And everything he does, everything he wants to do, takes a lot of effort. Because, in fact, in his 10 blocks, he was more likely to have one more block where that pat down was just a bit more aggressive. It's a handcuff, a button, a taser, someone pushed against the wall. He now feels that he actually has evidence of being clinically distressed. Okay, I would like to stop there. Now, maybe if I had the time is there, maybe I will stop there. But I think I have a little bit more time. The story gets a lot bleaker, though. If you knew that the particular research that I am publishing now gives us another story and another angle on this. If that protagonist, that woman, is living in a neighborhood, right, with that 10 years, 3 more events of intervention deaths, they face a 30 to 54% increase in the likelihood of having the trifecta of cardiovascular disease. This is high blood pressure, the diabetes, and obesity. So they don't just have one; they have all 3 of them. And we know that people who have that often have experienced relationships with people like Eric Garner and Corinne Gaines and George Floyd that have politicized them. So when she's walking to that, that clinic, she may have a hypertensive episode. She may have a spike in blood pressure. She has to weigh whether or not she will even go to the ER. And if she is the person that actually thinks her health is poor or fair, she's not going to go to the ER. She's instead going to go to that community clinic or try. And that community clinic is not any kind of community clinic. It's in the back of a building. And it serves people who don't want to be surveilled by the police for many reasons. And as she turns around to the back of that building, she sees the police. So the places essentially that people like her go to deal with emergency issues themselves are subject to the same problems of policing at a direct level as well as an indirect level. So that's a bit of the story, and I want to just take a little bit to link this over to COVID-19. We're in a situation today that if she's feeling all of the things I just told you to feel, she is also living in a neighborhood that has a concentration of COVID-19 cases, of COVID-19 hospitalizations. She's much less likely to actually have had access to testing at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, which means that there are more people around her that are carrying this virus symptomatically. They are dying in their homes much more likely than they are to ever get to the hospital. And we have to deal with that paradox. And so people in the health sciences really, they don't face a small feat. They have the tools to treat her, but by the time she may finally end up in their care, she will probably be very close to death from this same pandemic. It is imperative not only that you and I understand what social, what structural determinants of health that cause COVID-19 and its related outcomes that we are facing, that we are really facing as people ourselves and as advocates for the people we serve. Because if we don't know those things, it's really hard for us to translate to a general public why we need to do things such as defunding the police, divesting from the police, and even imagining what a world would look like if there were no police, if we didn't have these state level or federal level agents who could come in at any time and tell you and your neighbor how to deal with the injury that is being emitted in your neighborhood, but also provide their own source of injury that perpetuates the cycle. So I'll end up by saying something that I won't give a disclaimer for, I'll just say it. I've said this before. I've said a single sentence that even for me has a way of impacting myself. And it is, policing is the blood of America. It's a conduit of inequitable structures of violence at every angle, from community neighbors, from family members, from the police, from being simply a member of the residents of a neighborhood with that block I just described. We can talk about it. We can argue about it. We can defend it or disagree with it. And we can try to explain it away, right? But this reality that I feel, that many people feel as they see and think and hear those words, is not actually about the words. Policing is just policing. It is. Blood is literally blood. It has nothing but it in it. And America is America. These words operate in a particular space within the sentence structure where they could be subject, verb, and object. They could be the subject of a preposition or a declarative statement. They just are. They are the is, and the is. And that is something that we have to face both as social sciences and I would say humanistic sciences and health sciences as we think about how to move forward in this society. And I believe, and maybe this is just because I'm biased as a medical sociologist, that healthcare professionals have to be in the center of that conversation, because one of the reasons why we see the levels of mass incarceration that are that describe our society today is because medicine has advocated responsibility for treating those people who are being criminalized. They said, we can't help them anymore. We don't have any treatment for them. There's nothing we can do. We may not even be able to put them in a mental asylum. They're violent, right? They're genetically programmed to be that. They're super predators. So let someone else deal with them. And we're now in a policy environment that's essentially asking them to step up. And it's ironic that this same institution that has given away control, influence on the population, that's stigmatized by place and race, ethnicity, nation, religion, gender, sexuality, and their identity. They've given up a way of thinking about how to understand their problems and the way they're connected to these same social and structural determinants. We're asking them to take up a baton that they have not done effectively. You have the healthcare disparities and equities in utilization and help seeking, the same ones I talked about. We have the inequities in disease, and it has nothing to do with insurance. Sometimes it's literally just related to how doctors see patients, see their own patients. So we need them to level up. so to speak. We need them to grow up to the same levels that maybe some of us have already reached. Some of the places and stages of life we've already gotten to, a lot of them have not gotten there yet. So we need them to get on this train with us, and that requires for us to not just have the conversations about policy, but also to have the conversations about how we heal our society by just touching each other. In an environment where touching each other will literally kill us. So that's the ironies and the paradoxes. I'll leave it with that. Again, thank you so much for this time, and I appreciate any dialogue we can maybe go create around this topic.
Thank you so much, Eliasa, Professor Sewell. We really appreciate your comments. And again, we will be able to continue these topics that are being brought up in each of the panelists' talks with the Q&A. Our last speaker, but not least, Professor Alex Vital. He is author and professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. He's also the coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. He's had a long, distinguished career already. His recent work has been about police abolition, which he has discussed most prominently in his book, The End of Policing. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, USA Today, Vice News, and many other media outlets. I'm delighted to have Professor Vitale speak now. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, for inviting me and for putting me last on the panel, because it's always nice to hear what comes before. So the social sciences in general and sociology in particular has a policing problem. Too much of the mainstream of these many departments have spent too much of their energy working primarily to figure out how to re-legitimate policing, how to restore public trust in police following the death and the police killings of Mike Brown, Eric Garner, and so many others that we could see embodied in Obama's task force on 21st century policing, lacked any kind of real, critical, historical, or functional framework for understanding the nature of policing and its role in modern society. There have been consistent efforts to try to reform our way out of a fundamental structural problem in ways that are both superficial, ineffective, and ultimately, I think, deeply harmful because they retain the basic idea that police are the appropriate solution for a whole host of social problems without considering the implications or alternatives. So what are some of leads to some of this fundamental problem? Well, one is that there's an uncritical acceptance of the idea that the police are kind of neutral enforcers of a legal framework that automatically and necessarily benefits everyone equally. There's a famous 19th century saying that the law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets. But of course, the rich don't need to do those things. And the legal system is not benefiting everyone equally in that arrangement. Those legal systems were put in place to maintain a particular idea about the sanctity of private property in a society with deep economic inequality. And today we can see the same dynamic around the war on drugs. We've created a massive legal infrastructure at the state and federal level that was designed from the beginning to reproduce profound inequalities, mostly along the lines of race. We know now from people who are inside the Nixon White House that the war on drugs was not about drugs. It was not about public safety. It was not about public health. It was about a cynical politics of race designed to get historically white Democratic voters in the South to switch to the Republican Party in the wake of the victories of the civil rights movement. We don't need narcotics units to get anti-bias training to fix the profound racial disparities in the drug war. We need to end the drug war. And yet too much effort in the social sciences is focused entirely on this former initiative to try to fix the racism in the war on drugs with implicit bias training, a few procedural tweaks on racial profiling in traffic stops, and implementation of some body cameras and early warning systems for problem officers. This not only fails to misunderstand the nature of the legal frameworks that police are asked to enforce, and the lack of neutrality and the lack of equality that undergirds them, but it's also a failure of historical analysis. Much of the research on policing rests on a kind of liberal myth-making about the nature of policing. When we look at textbooks on policing and most research that's done in the social sciences, there's a kind of uncritical acceptance that, well, policing begins in 1829 with the formation of the London Metropolitan Police, and that this is essentially a progressive development to create a more professional, law enforcement-oriented and more legitimate form of law enforcement that is, an advance on the informal watch or relying on the military. But what's always left out of this analysis is, where did this idea come from and what was its true functional nature? So the inventor of the London Metropolitan Police, Sir Robert Peel, Bob, the Bobbies, actually develops the idea of modern policing while he is in charge of the English occupation of Ireland, a colonial project of the First Order. And during that period, there were a whole series of agricultural uprisings against the occupation, but Peel was in a bind because the British military was tied up with Napoleon and the coffers were empty. And so he develops the Irish Peace Preservation Force as a more efficient, preemptive, community-embedded form of political policing. And he takes that model and applies it to the rapidly expanding population of London, of basically agricultural refugees who've been displaced by the enclosures, a new system of private property, and channeled into the new industrial workforce. And that early London Metropolitan Police Force is tasked not just with the overt breaking of strikes and the undermining of the labor movement, but also the micromanagement of the everyday lives of this new population in a way that Mark Neoclaus calls the fabrication of social order to create a stable, docile workforce. In the United States, we see the development of policing not initially based on the London model, but based on slave patrols. Now, this has become a bit of a cliche that's tossed out sometimes, but I would argue that the first police force in the world that fits the definition of a liberal modern police force is actually the Charleston City Guard and Watch, formed in the late 1700s to manage a mobile slave population. In the big cities of the South, slaves work outside the home of their owners, outnumber the white population, and they need a professional, 24-hour, uniformed law enforcement body whose primary mission is to enforce the laws of slavery. But the liberal scholars of policing don't want to start the conversation of policing with the enforcement of those laws. So they talk about Boston and New York that happened decades later, and the liberal myth-making continues. We had our own colonial policing in the form of the Texas Rangers and other Western police forces whose primary initial function was the extermination of indigenous populations, the driving out of Spanish and Mexican landholders to make way for white settlement. In addition to those failures, the social sciences have failed to calculate the actual costs of policing. We see a huge number of scholars who may be critical of policing in some important ways, who may understand some of this history, but always seem to feel the need to fall back on, but, well, we have a couple of studies that show that if we use more police, we can get a 10% reduction in this kind of crime or this kind of disorder. But those studies uniformly fail to calculate the actual costs of relying on policing to achieve those very thin positive results, many of which are fundamentally in question to begin with. We've already heard a little bit from Alyasa and from Philip about what some of those costs are. Costs to the health of those who have never even directly experienced police violence, of the ways in which people are alienated from their own communities, their own homes, their own neighborhoods, and their own place in American society by intensive and invasive policing. But also, what are the financial costs? What are the opportunity costs of pouring billions of dollars into a system that relies on violence and coercion to achieve its ends? Ends that are not necessarily in everyone's best interests. We have diverted in many cases 30, 40, 50% of municipal budgets into policing and jails at the expense of basic health systems, quality education, community-based recreation and health infrastructures, so that in many cities the police budget is more than the combined value of the health department, youth services, job readiness training, community development, parks, all combined. So this movement is asking for a complete rethink on why we have come to rely on policing to solve every social problem under the sun. This is a political project. It is not a value-neutral approach. While policing has always had a problematic nature, we've seen over the last 40 years a dramatic re-intensification of policing, expanding into ever more aspects of daily life for the already most vulnerable communities in our society. A lot of this is tied to a set of neoliberal austerity politics that have pushed wealth up the economic ladder in hopes that some of it will magically trickle down to the neighborhoods. But instead of that trickle down, what we've seen is the rise of mass homelessness, the rise of mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, mass involvement in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods out of economic necessity, economic precarity, social isolation, and discrimination. And that is what policing exists to do. If we look at what police actually do day in and day out, it is the management of those social problems. And then when police do that in a way that is violent and racially discriminatory, we're told, well, we'll fix that with some implicit bias training, some police community meetings, and body cameras. And what we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years is the complete failure of these approaches to do anything meaningful about the problems of police violence and also the everyday negative consequences of relying on violence workers to deal with the problems of mass homelessness, substance abuse disorders, untreated mental health problems, failing schools, youth violence, domestic violence, etc. So it's time for sociology to try to disarticulate itself from the criminal legal system. Too many of our departments have been captured by the criminal justice system. I know when I was a graduate student, there were almost no jobs for urbanists and everyone was hiring a criminologist. And this has fundamentally shaped the direction of our discipline in deeply problematic ways because our departments have become focused on their connections to these institutions, the channeling of students into those jobs, and too often we have failed to critically assess the functional nature of these institutions. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation to follow.
Thank you so much. So we do have already a few questions, and if I could just ask the panelists to come back on, and what we could do is you can see in the Q&A there some questions. They're actually in the order of people in the number of upvotes they have. And I would sort of just condense these questions into maybe 2 questions, and then I can ask the panelists to respond. The first one it goes directly to Mr. Mcharris. And it's a question about the residents' reactions when you discussed some of the ideas of alternative community interventions and services you mentioned, especially some of the older residents who you mentioned sometimes have a more favorable view or relationship with the police. How do they respond to these ideas of reimagined policing? So I think, we'd love to hear more about the residents and their own thoughts about policing. And you mentioned that you feel like they do want more policing, but some kind of alternative forms. And so if you maybe could just say a little bit about that, that'd be fantastic. And if any of the other panelists want to jump in on that as well, you could do that. And then another question here is, a related question is about the mass media bias, potential bias in these issues. And then finally, there is a point about police officers carrying firearms, and can we imagine what might happen if they didn't carry firearms, right? So Scott Godkins asks, carrying a firearm instantly escalates every situation. How would the residents feel about a patrol of unarmed case managers that work for the city but carry no firearms or any weapons and would not make arrests? So just to put some things on the table, I'll ask each of you maybe to speak for a couple minutes about these. You can answer them the way you want, or you can answer which questions you want. So let's just go in the same order of the presentations. So Philip, if you want to answer.
Sure. Thank you for everyone who asked these questions. I think in terms of framing, I think it's important to note that even sort of like in theorizing and having conversations, the importance of prioritizing reimagining public safety and thinking about what public safety can look like, as opposed to a narrow focus on what reinventing or reimagining policing can or should look like. Because the framing implies that sort of, the goal is to reimagine policing as opposed to reimagining public safety, which can include the divestment and abolishing of policing for some. And I think that's an important distinction because specifically what people want, from my experience and from my research, what people want is safety and security, but people are told that police are the only entity that can provide that. From when they're born to when they come of age or however old they are, people are told policing is the only entity. Police are the people who provide or are the stewards of public safety, and when people do bad things, they deserve to go to prison. And this is the way that we have justice and the way that we create safety. And so in the community where the logic is, okay, well, we want safety and security, and this is sort of what I mentioned during the conversation around policing and the broader criminal legal system as a socializing force that creates ideas and part of a broader culture, is that people want safety and security and are told that police are the only entity that can provide it. And so that becomes the immediate sort of response. And on top of it, the only resourced response that communities often get are police, especially disadvantaged communities. And so, when I mentioned before, when people ask for things like getting the elevator fixed, or there's no gas in the building, or, poverty or hunger, the response from the government is, we don't have the money for that. But the only thing in the entire ecosystem around carbon projects that's actually well-resourced is the police. It's literally the only thing that if you look, that has the adequate resources, it's the police. And so when people are saying we want safety and they're told that the only response is policing, then people, of course, are going to say, well, if the answer is then that or nothing, even for those residents who are more favorable to the police, people are going to say, yeah, we want, police because that's the only act. So again, I think to answer some of the questions, when people are posed with alternatives and said, as opposed to saying, do you want more or less police, saying, for domestic violence, would you rather a specialized team that has the resources and tools to respond to those specific cases? Would you rather have that or an armed, team of police officers come to try to intervene and potentially arrest and sort of that be the end of the day? People choose that. If you say, if there was a security guard and a doorman, in a way to help, using an intercom system to allow people to get in or out of the building, would you rather that, or would you rather have two armed police officers with their red and blue lights constantly flashing, outside of the residence that don't do anything except stand there, because the idea is that they will deter anything from happening just because of their presence, because of the threat of or the fear of coercion and violence and arrest. And so to sort of wrap it up, I think, when people are given alternatives that seem like they will actually be well-resourced and can be driven by the actual community, people are far more likely to go with that. And I think a part of the broader question is, if we're thinking around public safety, what is the best way to design preventions to violence, conflict, and harm, safety interventions once it happens, and responses that are based on safety and accountability and not punishment and control, and thinking of what that can look like. And a part of what I try to do is ask residents what that would look like, as opposed to starting from the premise that police and prisons are the models of public safety and we have to tinker with it in order to to bring about something else. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you. Ayasa, would you like to add to that?
I might not add to that. I probably want to get to this issue of the mass media, because I think that's kind of where a lot of my research kind of goes with, and maybe not the research per se, but I want to just give you a moment here about kind of when we see this mass mobilization around defending Black lives as a result of how we're coding what police do and the notion energy attached to things like America and blood and policing. Let's have this conversation. And I might push back against this idea of mass media having so much effect in informing our viewpoints. I think you're right in some sense, and the extent to which those conglomerates which reflect back the racial biases of our system. But I might offer you a different angle that doesn't come from much research, but comes from a lot of activists. Hashtag Black Lives Matter is not an academic term. It's not a media term. It's a term of activists as a response to the time they believe when the criminal justice system didn't provide justice. This is the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, and 4 years later after that, you get mass levels of mobilization in Ferguson after the murder of Mike Brown, and people are like, well, why are they going off on Mike Brown when about a month later, there were probably more sporadic, but there were types of mobilization around Eric Garner. But Ferguson was different. The level of the number of activists that essentially, I want to use a word that has a lot of flavor in it, but came to Ferguson was far more varied and from so many more places than how people organized around Eric Garner. And there are two things that influence what happens. The first mentioning of Mike Brown in the media didn't come from the media. It came from a Twitter storm among people who we call Black Twitter about what was happening. There was a conversation among people who were there on that block, watching things with activists around the country, sharing conversations and stories and videos. Like, this is going on. And it was probably 2 to 3 days that we had a concerted conversation with the media, these conglomerates about what was going on. By that time, the movement that we saw on TV had already had a flavor to it. And the activists that came quickly to that moment were Black Lives Matter activists. So instead of saying no justice, no peace, people were saying Black Lives Matter, right? And that's a thing. And that wasn't created by the media, but it was created by seeing the videos, by hearing those recordings that then led people to mobilize and advocate along these issues. And the reason why all that is important is because of the role the government has in the mass media and in the control of the media. Since, and it actually happened before Ferguson movement, but as a response to the organizing capacities of people who called on the hashtag of Black Lives Matter, the CIA, I'm not joking, this is not a conspiracy theory, began to monitor the cell phones of people who would say those hashtags. So it became increasingly difficult for advocates to call for mobilization moments and events without being circumvented, right? So they developed alternative techniques to deliver information through online platforms, but not through the ones that were being surveilled by the criminal justice system, the media, and so on and so forth. So what I would answer as a way to think about the role of media is that there are multiple forms of mass media. Some are given energy in one way and some are given energy in another way. And what we see at this moment, and what we saw in Ferguson, what we're seeing now in the George Floyd protests, what we saw during the Castile and Alton Sterling, is the competition between these types of mobilization efforts, because the media is a mobilization institution. And essentially, I remember hearing a speech by one of the leading activists around Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives, saying, listen, you can solve the problem. It's easy. You want us to stop protesting? You want us to leave the streets? Arrest the cops. Arrest not just the cop that was on that corner on the knees and watching it and then looking away, but all the cops in every city, in every state, that you're not holding them accountable for the injury, not just the fatal injury, but like the psychological injury that they're enacting upon primarily Black and brown bodies. So I'll leave there, and I want to just remind you that we cannot think about this as a top-down way of understanding the world. We have resistance, and it's on the ground that the resistance that's pushing the way we see this moment right now.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to?
Yeah, maybe I'll touch on a couple of things. So there's media in terms of like Hollywood and the production of fictional narratives and reality television, which is itself a kind of fictionalized narrative. And then there's the mainstream news media. But in both cases, they're both actively involved in the project of relegitimating policing. And this has always been the case historically. I grew up in the era of Adam 12 and the Mod Squad, and these were both, I think, highly self-conscious efforts, in some cases directly co-produced with police departments, to send a message in the wake of the riots and uprisings of the 1960s that that policing is not the problem anymore. They're going to be more professional in the case of Adam 12, dispassionate law enforcement, or in the case of the Mod Squad, they're going to be hip, representative of the community, connect with the people to get the bad guys. But in all these cases, there's no fundamental questioning of why we have turned problems over to violence workers. In fact, they try to downplay the fact that these are fundamentally violence workers. And this leads to the second issue of disarming the police. I don't think the way to do this is to try to somehow create like a British model where you have mostly unarmed police and then a very small number of armed rapid response units. I think instead we need to take functions away from the police and turn them over to non-violence workers. This is the way to disarm the police and to reduce the violence is to quit using violence workers, to bring counselors back to schools instead of school resource officers, to health business. We have very clear evidence-backed ideas and examples, and in some cases, very strongly tested models about what we could do today to address very real public safety problems without all the violence.
Great, thank you. That does actually connect with some of the other questions that are coming up, right? So there's very strong sense, it seems like all three of you do share this sense that one of the things that needs to be done, and in the short term, right, to kind of one of the questions is what can be done to stop the bleeding as we think about longer term structural solutions. In the short term is to defund and to redirect funds maybe to away from violence and towards non-violence workers, as you say. Some people, fear, and it sounds like Jacob Thomas is from UCLA, his question could be inserted here, right? What are the dangers or possibilities of doing that and then maybe private security forces taking over or some other forces taking over? I mean, we've seen, for example, Trump's ability to use the federal government forces and to intervene. So obviously these can't be solved, but I'm just wondering if any of you have thought about, this, how a defunding movement might have certain unintended consequences. I don't know if you thought about that. So does anyone want to address that? That'd be fantastic. And then just a related question, maybe we could think about, maybe that one's enough for now.
Yeah.
Jump in on that. Yeah.
I can respond to that. I think to that point, I think, I also do related work and research within the movement for Black Lives and sort of amongst spaces that are calling for these pushes. And I think a part of this is as opposed to looking at it like defunding or abolishing individual police, it's about divesting from policing as a response. And so policing can be done by local entities. It can be done by sheriffs and state troopers. It can be done by, and now we see by federal entities. And I think that the focus is then defunding policing as opposed to specific offices, departments. And as, from that framework, if we think around divesting, and there's also third-party entities that police and punish that aren't necessarily a part of the formal law enforcement apparatus. And I think, reinvesting funds in alternatives and community resources and institutions, and as a model of safety and accountability, and decoupling punishment and control from a broader vision of public safety is the focus. And so I think in terms of the unintended consequence, I think, the focus is then on the policing and the violence work, and, things like in Berkeley, they recently announced that they were removing police from traffic safety, right? And so thinking about different ways, as Alex mentioned, to begin dramatically reducing the power and scope of policing, because, it comes down to the reforms have been recycled for decades. And, the model is, okay, we have this terrible thing. If we implement this, this intervention and it gives us this marginal effect, then if you start from the premise that, people are experiencing vast levels of trauma and violence, and you say that this can, shift or change this by this marginal effect, that approach is different than how do we approach ending gender-based violence? How do we approach ending violence within communities? And also, I think a part of what I wanted to just lift up again is a part of meeting the basic needs of people. Because we know that when people do not have the resources that they need to live and survive, that it increases the likelihood of conflict and violence. And that's one of the most robust findings within sociological literature. And so I think taking this seriously, because a part of this is that there, in the social sciences and more broadly, that there's a focus on particular forms of violence and harm that often happen in specific places and on the street. I'm not saying that these things shouldn't be focused on, because they should. which is a part of why these alternatives and getting at the underlining what leads to these instances to begin with. But a big part of this is that when people are hungry, when people don't have clean water, when people are experiencing lead poisoning, when people don't have enough resources and food, when people are dying from coronavirus, not because it just is destined, but because of lack of resources, that these are all forms of violence and structural violence and harm that happen every day. But we have this approach that sensationalizes certain kinds of things. And actually, the focus on policing and punishment in the criminal legal system as it stands, it does actively harm certain people, but it actually gets in the way of developing a real rigorous approach to public safety because of resources, but also because of the ideological investment in police and prisons as the only and the main, the guarantors of public safety, when we see that that's not true and often, quite contrary.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Just feel free.
Yeah, I might offer a perspective from a medical perspective. So when people talk about refunding society, often they mention three people: social workers, nurses, and people who are specifically trained in dealing with trauma, such as mental health professionals, because they are sensitized to understanding what happens when someone are faced with a life that they believe is not worth living, or that they want to change so much by taking away from other people the things maybe that they need to survive. Those other people need to survive as well as themselves. So this is said over and over again. And one of the unintentional consequences of refunding these essentially helping sciences is the increasing medicalization of a social problem. And this is the history of medicine. This is the way that medicine has achieved so much political and economic power, is because they have increasingly made every part of the body, every dysfunction, they call it now, every reaction of the body, a medical problem with a medical solution that we can mostly put in a pill or a liquid, that if you take it, you will not have any more problems. So that means if you are taking it and you still have problems, the problem is yours, not ours, right? So you're going to move into that medical model. And the solution, I think, there to moving beyond that unintentional consequences, because we do need to think about concrete ways of moving forward, is to actually adjust the value we place on doctors. Love them. I have a couple of them. I have a whole team of doctors, but readjust that. Because when we look at the economic compensation for what types of doctors are given more money, more benefits, whatever you want to call it, bigger cars and bigger houses for their care, it is not nurses and mental health professionals and social workers count within this space. They're not getting the money. The people who are getting the money are actually the people who can't work right now. They're the really specialized surgeons who don't work on the left side of the heart, but the right side of the heart. And they have developed such a specialty from decades, or not, well, probably a decade by the time they start getting the money, but rotation after rotation and really specific training on one thing. So they become so valuable to a city that there's only one of them that can work there, because that person can take on, they cost so much to employ, and they can take on that one specific problem. So people pay an arm and a leg for their services, an arm and a leg. On the other hand, when someone has had all of these social problems we're talking about, and they have that moment where they can't remember like where they put their shoes and which day it is, and when they last took a bath, and so they get mad, they get angry about like their own inability to figure out their life. We call that disorganized thoughts. We call what they may do a manic episode. We give them a diagnosis and we say, hey, take a pill and spend the rest of your life trying to titrate how your body reacts to that pill and any other pill. And your job in life is to become, quote unquote, normal. Become that thing that everybody else is. And the irony is that nobody's normal. There's no ideal man. There's no type of anything. So what we're asking people to do by giving these refunding solutions to the medical community in its various forms is to actually reinforce the very same thing we're trying to solve. But the medical community does it in a different way with different tools. They do the same thing though. And what we have to actually rethink is to how do we value the people within these spaces who are trained to deal with hyper and multiply marginalized populations. And those people have a hard time getting money to do their job because the insurance companies won't pay them more than $90 an hour. Whereas that person that's specialized in that one part of the ventricle ward of the heart is being paid $10,000 for what they do an hour. So they're trying to eat. And the other one is trying to figure out where they're going to put their boat. And that's the problem. That is the problem, because the things that we value in society aren't the people that we are trying to find solutions for on how to, I would say, I'm just going to throw it out there, control.
Thank you. Alex, do you want to add anything? I think you're...
Well, I think if we understand, right, that police, how about now? If we understand that police exist to facilitate regimes of exploitation, that they are producing an order that makes possible exploitation, then we need both short-term strategies and long-term strategies. So I sort of put myself in the left realist camp with folks like Jock Young, who say that, yes, we ultimately need to build to a world where these regimes of exploitation are radically reoriented, diminished, eliminated. But we can't wait for that far-off future of dramatic structural change to address problems of harm, whether it's defined as crime or other things right now, because those systems of harm actually undermine our ability to build towards that bigger, greater future we're working on, because it disorganizes communities and it drives people to the right out of desperation. They embrace policing and criminal justice-oriented solutions. So we need interventions that can do something about that bigger future. And that's why it's important that we not fall into the trap of superficial procedural reforms as intermediate steps of improving conditions, because that logic rests on the legitimacy of policing. And ideologically, once we go down that road, we are actually cutting legs out from under any kind of broader progressive vision, analysis, or agenda, because policing rests on a fundamental understanding about how the world works, a Manichaean worldview that says there are the good people and there are the bad people, and we're here to X out those bad people because they are morally deficient, they are super predators, they can't be, they're always already guilty of something, right? And that is fundamentally inconsistent with a worldview that says we need to work towards building up people, building up communities, creating more equality and a better, safer, healthier world.
Fantastic, thank you. There's a lot of questions now, and I'm sort of, it's really difficult. We have 303 participants, and it's hard to get through all these questions. But we do have a few more minutes, and I think that maybe there's a couple of points that maybe come out that are shared. One is a question about, I guess I would put it as a question of, it's still a question of change and maybe the obstacles that are preventing even short-term change. One, Alex, you're talking about, and I think all of you are sort of getting at a mindset where we think we turn to police as the solution, and we all agree that can't be the thing, and that we think about other organizations or institutions. I think some people might be interested, and again, some of these comments are getting at that, on the pragmatics of implementing these changes. And one of the things that people have brought up is the power of the police unions, and maybe their connection to political elites. That's one issue. Another issue that seems to come up in the questions is kind of shifting a little bit to a more academic but important issue, which is the type of data about policing that we have, and data issues. So I don't know if any one of you maybe spend the last couple minutes. I'll throw those two out there. If any of you want to say anything about this, that is the pragmatics and the issue of maybe police unions having power, the political power, the obstacles to change. And then this other question about data, if any of you want to say anything about these, we can close out with those. We have a few more minutes left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think on the police union piece, I think that's a major piece right now that people are figuring out how to navigate, because police unions and contracts do wield a considerable amount of power. I think a part of this becomes down to political will, because the reason why police unions are often so powerful is because they mobilize, and political leaders and elected officials who want the support of these unions often have to navigate in ways that sort of are suitable to them, or they face alienation. And we know that when police unions respond, they often, they often have these very extreme responses to things that can discourage elected officials from disagreeing with them in sort of like in future moments. And so, I think a part of this though is that and I think that's sort of a strategy of the movement as it is today, is to create a populace, and really develop the power amongst communities. Is to say that if a majority or if a large amount of community residents are saying like, hey, we want, alternatives, and we want to defund and reinvest, then it can begin to start outweighing the political capital and influence of unions on elections and the like. And so I think a part of it, and so the Working Families Party recently announced a fellowship where they're providing funds for elected officials to run on campaigns of invest, divest. And so I think that a part of this is building political power. And there's also some movements within unions to reconceive of police unions as not in the interest of labor rights, and what it would look like to shift away from the incorporation of police unions and in broader labor collectives. And that's like, there's tension around that. But a part of this is also the broader history of policing, is that police in many ways were responsible for breaking and disrupting labor organizing. So I think there's some internal conversations around that piece. And in terms of the the second piece?
Yeah, you want to say something about the data and measurement that we use?
Oh, yeah.
You already alluded to this a little bit with the predictive policing stuff, right? And
no, yeah. So I think that this is actually key, because a part of the framework has gone in terms of research around policing is that, okay, we know the data is bad, but this is what we have, so we're going to use it anyway. And I think a part of this is really taking serious just how bad and incomplete the data around policing actually is. Because there was a, for example, there was a Campaign Zero, specifically the 8 Can't Wait. They used data, and they said that if we implement these 8 things, basically we can reduce police violence by 72%. And they were using these linear models that will predict, in a linear fashion. And they ended up taking these statistics down and restructuring the claims and saying that they are for structural changes in defunding and abolition. But a part of the reason why it caught so much attention is because people said, "Oh wow, we can reduce police killings by 72%." The first problem is that it was conflating police killings with police violence. And most people that experience police brutality and police violence don't die. And so that's one part. But there's so much, most people that often experience police violence don't report it. And there's certain kinds of police violence and terror and structural violence that one can't report. Like when someone is interacting with a police officer and pulled over, and they fear that they might die and their adrenaline spikes, and they have these real psychophysiological responses that can't be measured. Well, it can be measured in some ways, but it can't be measured in the way that we can really get this full picture. You know, and so I think a large part of this is also really taking seriously the idea that we actually are not able to really capture the full extent of police violence. There, you know, there is no way, which is a part of the push from activists and organizers to say, as opposed to trying to tinker with this to see what marginal effects we can have by increasing this or reducing this, we know that there are real, not sort of like, you know, feel good ways, but actual real ways in interventions that we can implement that can keep communities safe in a sustainable way, that don't rely on somebody, you know, deterring, but actually can get at the underlining, you know, factors, and also can have teams that can respond, that might be unarmed teams of civilians that can respond to certain situations, to de-escalate, to intervene. Violence interrupters is an example. But oftentimes they're set up for failure because they're not funded adequately. And oftentimes police can intervene and interrupt the efforts. And so a part of this is actually really taking serious, you know, funding these efforts, and also giving the time for them to actually develop, and taking the time to say, okay, well, we're going to take a year, for example, to get community input. We're going to reimagine public safety. It's sort of in this Minneapolis model. And we're going to take a year to actually get input on what are the things that people experience that make them feel unsafe, and what are the responses that make the most sense to prevent those things, to respond to those things when they're happening, and to respond to those moments of conflict and violence and harm that can actually provide safety and accountability and healing, if in restoration, as opposed to we're going to respond with, you know, guns, punishment, control, and incarceration. Yeah.
I would like to jump in here, and I'll be super quick, because the data of policing is all I deal with. And I just want to say there are three types of data. One, two, three. There are four types of data that we have regularly available about policing. Of course, we have the police reports, and we know where they're not reliable, and we can and cannot use them regardless, but we can get information from them, is what I would argue. There's also the fatal encounters data set. These essentially are some type of a report in the public of a killing that involves the police. So the killing, particularly of a civilian, that involves a police. And I'll just offer a little bit of comment between those two things. There was a call that started really being public, probably 2011. Nancy Krieger wrote a piece that police killings are public health data. And it's a great argument. And you read through it, and you're like, yes, 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 yes. And the primary impetus of that model is we don't have systematic measures of police killings. And she's right and she's wrong. We actually have a diagnostic criteria in the World Health Organization's identification of why people die that is literally legal intervention death. It also is applied to injuries. So yes, you can actually go to the CDC's website. It's called WISCAR, and you can identify in every state, every city, who is given that responsibility. How many times is a medical examiner given? And again, medical examiners are paid by the state and selected by the state. That diagnosis that the police kill. The problem is that these types of measures only apply to about 47% of actual police killings. On the flip side, when they're right, they're really, really right. They're really, really right. And the example I'd give is actually Crown Heights in Brooklyn, where in that 10-year period I talked about in pre-Floyd, and this is actually South Bronx as well, the two highest neighborhoods that reported police killings, all more so than in legal intervention deaths, all more so than the fatal encounters data set. So the medical examiners identified more police responsibility than fatal encounters did. And the reason why is exactly what Philip is talking about, because people don't know, and some people don't report, and some people themselves don't even know it's a police officer that killed them. They're undercover police officers. This is a thing. So, but the medical examiners know. They know because they have to look at the body, they have to look at why the body is injured, and so on and so forth. And I'll offer some alternatives. One alternative is citizen complaints, but again, it suffers from the same thing that Philip is talking about. The other one, people are not going to believe me when I say this, but I'm going to offer it anyway. Illness is actually a predictor of violence. It literally is it is a social political concept. We think about it as a outcome of policing. It is also an indicator of systemic violence because it is connected to everything that policing is connected to. It is literally the life force of everything. So if you can trace how people die, maybe if you don't even have a police indicator and you're able to track it to other types of things we do know, you actually can come up with fairly consistent and very actually valid and reliable indicators of how police kill. And I'll end just by saying that we're not there right now. Our modeling of how systemic violence actually happens is nowhere near that place. And I think we, as social scientists and as scientists in general, we have to advocate for ourselves as people who are knowledge. We are the quote unquote experts of how to know something. So it doesn't matter what type of way you know something, whether it's a voice or a number or a note, right? Music is data too, right? That can be turned into an indicator of how police actually function in our society, so much so to we have an uprising against the police, not because, or we have uprising in this moment, not because 300,000 people have died of COVID, but because of one instant, one moment that everybody could feel, even if they did or did not know about number of people in that same block who had died of COVID. This was the moment that they said, hey, you know what? Police are doing something. And this recognition, that's a policing event too. That's what I'm offering. That itself, that recognition that I'm feeling bad right now, I want to do something about it. That's a policing moment. And it doesn't come from the perspective of the police. It doesn't come from the perspective of the state. It's something, you're right, that you may understand, you're not even knowing it's going on in your body, but it is something that's manifested in your life. Okay, so we can trace that.
Thank you. So we are getting close to we're already over our time, but I wanted to give Alex a last opportunity to close up.
I posted a couple links on police unions. I'll just say two quick things. One is that they should not be part of the labor movement. And two, that any politics that their money or endorsement cannot be our friend. On the data side, it depends on what the research design is. We don't need more data to support efforts to figure out how to restore trust in policing. The procedural reformers connected with like the Obama task force, they tried to say, oh, we're going to fix this with these procedural reforms. When it hasn't worked, now they're like, well, we need more data. More data, we need to create police racism dashboards so that we understand all the nature of police so that we can fix it with little training interventions. No, we don't need any more of that kind of data. If people are trying to figure out concretely what the costs of policing is, what the burden of policing is on society, yes, we need research on that. But that's not what's being funded. If we need research on what the alternatives to policing look like, their effectiveness, we need more money for that. But mostly we need more money for community-based efforts to actually carry out experiments on non-coercive, non-carceral public safety strategies. And then finally, I just want to address one of the questions about whether or not Sidney's work on policing a class society is the right way to think about this. And I would just say that he has an excellent analysis of the roots of policing in class, but he leaves out the issues of slavery and colonialism. And the trick is, and I put some links in the chat about that, is that this is a three-foot stool. They all go together. This is never just about the white working class. This has always also been about colonialism and slavery.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I very much regret that we are going to have to end, but I am happy that we can continue this discussion in the further panels. We have a lot of other panels coming up. The next one's at 11:30. But for now, I want to thank so much Professor Sewell, Philip, and Professor Vitale for enlightening us and getting us started. It's been a fantastic way to start this bigger discussion. I really want to thank you very much, and I hope to see you and the attendees that are here now, maybe in future panels, and we can maybe pick up some of these further questions that were raised here. Maybe we can pick them up again in the future. So thank you very much, and hope to see some of you back at 11:30. Thank you.